Welcome to Growth for Good, the show about amplifying impact for nonprofits, charities, and social purpose businesses. I'm Daniel Francavilla, a marketing advisor and brand strategist and your host. On this show, I interview leaders at nonprofits and social enterprises and the organizations that support them. We discuss the wins, challenges, and best practices when it comes to communications, marketing, fundraising, and impact. Let's dive into today's episode. So welcome, Joy. Thanks so much for coming out to be on the Growth for Good podcast.
Thanks.
Super excited to have you. Today, we're going to be talking about all things Data for Good, which is the name of the organization that you're with. I'd love to start off by getting a little bit of your story to let us know how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Well, my education and professional experience are all grounded in data, technical marketing, strategy analytics, and sort of pioneering new areas of innovation. And I've just always been drawn to that space. And so I enjoy leading people to greener pastures as well. So when you combine that with a sense of civic duty and wanting to give back, you find me where I am today. So it's a nice culmination of a lot of things I had done leading up to launching Data for Good.
Yes. And what is your kind of elevator pitch for Data for Good?
Elevator pitch. Okay, so we call Data for Good the Canadian voice for data scientists with a conscience. And we operate as a volunteer-driven national not-for-profit so that we can support the social sector on a pro bono basis. Nice. Because I was drawn to things that the lawyers were doing, doctors were doing, it's like giving back and it raised the bar, the professional bar for their colleagues. And I wanted that for my colleagues as well. Yep. And so we now have 9 active chapters across the country and we're approaching 10 years of operations.
That's amazing. Congrats on that.
That is crazy, that part.
Yeah, it's always great when you can see something spread and take off, and it shows that there's a real need for this. In the worlds of design and branding, same thing. There's a lot of organizations that can't afford to pay, these very, very big, large budgets for rebranding, for marketing, for campaigns. And there's some amazing initiatives right now that are for pro bono, and I think it's great. There's such great work being done. Yeah. We get to share our talents for good, right? Cool. So how did you end up in the sector to begin with? How did you find yourself here?
Well, I mean, way back in school, there was a group called SAGA, Students Active and Globally Aware. And I joined that with friends. And so we got involved in things like World Vision, UNICEF, and it just started there, right?
Nice,
sort of in middle school kind of thing. And it never left my system because I kept wanting to get involved and always drawn to the sector. So even though I went and did an MBA and I worked in Fortune 500, corporate North America, corporate global as well, I still had a part of me that was drawn back to the social sector.
I love that. And I think for a lot of people, it does start in high school or even middle school, but then you kind of drift away and you may never make your way back to the nonprofit or the charitable world. So it's awesome to hear that's part of your story. So if you're, we want to provide value, right, to different organizations. So, whether you're a nonprofit, a brand, a candidate, an artist, we're all competing for attention. So what are some things that organizations can do to stand out in this attention economy?
Well, I believe a lot in user-generated content. I think, owners care more about what they're engaged with. So when volunteers are empowered to find their own partner organizations, run their own events, and support the issues that actually matter to them personally, I think that in turn makes for much more motivated people. So people who are willing to share their precious time and talents. And it's the opposite of micromanagement. It's volunteer empowerment. And when you have what's so-called brand advocates or empowered creators who really care about what they're engaged with, then I think you have a winning formula. So it is. I speak like that, and I sound like a marketer person, right? But then I think about it, and I go, but it's so true in the volunteer-driven sector too. Why would someone be motivated if they don't actually care?
Right.
Why would they be giving their time? And in our case, so much talent. Like our volunteers are so talented. Why would they do that if they weren't empowered and they weren't making their own choices, their free will to give that?
Exactly. And yeah, so the same goes true in, corporate brands as it does with volunteering and with, social causes. So obviously I've I've seen you speak. I've seen you on a podcast. That's why you're here today.
Great, cool.
And so, personal branding is really important in this space as well. What role has your personal brand and network played in, your role in the sector, your success in the sector?
I'd say it has played a significant role because I was already at an executive level in my own career when I went looking for board members and co-founders for Data for Good. So I looked for people who would balance out what I brought to the organization and people who had talents and abilities that were stronger or better than mine,
right,
and in certain areas. And so I knew I couldn't build and grow Data for Good alone, and I really didn't want to. But I did hit the ground running because I had already been working for a lot of years,
right,
and I had a pretty good network
in
my space already. Yeah.
Yep, and you were able to kind of leverage that and pull it over into
to a point. Yeah,
world.
Not everyone cared what I was doing or up to, but some people were like, "That's awesome. How could I help?" And so it did have an initial momentum from that.
And did you find that kind of with that shift, you've been doing this for almost 10 years now. Did it take a while to kind of, associate this with your identity?
Yeah, and I part of me says I shouldn't be the brand because I'm mortal, right? I want the brand to be immortal. And so although a brand needs someone to connect with it or people to connect with it, especially to give it personality when it's launching, ultimately you want a brand to be self-sustaining and to have its own identity. So my goal is that the brand is stronger than any ego or personality or the charisma of the founders. I want the brand to be stronger than that.
Yeah, and what better way to do that than have chapters where there's other people taking ownership and leading that as well.
Next generation leaders, yeah.
Exactly. So we know that in the nonprofit world, in the business world, there's always going to be challenges. What are some of the challenges that you've had to deal with, in your role at any stage in your career or specifically with Data for Good?
Well, with Data for Good, I would say that we were cut from sort of the startup cloth, like lean, mean, and hungry. And so there was a lot of early days where I would say turnover and maybe even some burnout was a factor. So we can't go back and change time. That was the genesis of how we emerged. And so now we're a more established not-for-profit. There's a bit more maturity to the organization, and what we do and how we do it. There's some more process. There's some more guidelines. I'd say that when you realize you're at a crossroads, don't be afraid to go back to the drawing board. Like, what's the harm in that? What's the harm? There's no harm. You have to think fresh and know, tackle the issue and be willing to come up with or hear new ideas from others. How else can you break through to the next level? It's
true. And sometimes, you're very driven. A lot of organizations are so mission driven and they have that in mind, but they may not be open to changing the tactics and the approach. Right. So I love that you mentioned it's so important to revisit that.
I think it's because from marketing advertising, I'm youth culture focused. So I'm always like, no, come on. What's new? What's fresh? What's up and coming? Yep. And that's helpful. Really helpful.
It's huge. The sector definitely needs that. So I agree with you on that. So when it comes to celebrating your success and showcasing impact, I think that's a huge part of what we do in this space. One or two recent wins that you could share? I would love to know what you consider that.
Okay, you may appreciate this. I don't know if others would appreciate it as much, but I really enjoyed when we got a new logo and a fresh website. We started to look very polished to the outside world, and being in startup mode in the early stages. It had its perks, but I've spent many years also working for Fortune 500 best practice organizations with deep pockets, and so it felt good to see Data for Good get fancy. And so that was, to me, I was like, wow, we're really growing up now, aren't we? That felt good.
Yep.
But in terms of impact, we aim to produce case studies that showcase the work that goes on via our datathons and our micro projects. So each partnership with each fantastic organization, I think we're approaching up 80 now.
Wow.
And, great, amazing organizations across the country doing such important work. And the results and the insights from every single engagement, we do try to document it. It's important, so we do try to produce those case studies to showcase it.
Case studies are huge. What would you say is what are the formats you use for these case studies? Are they articles? Are they blog posts? Are they,
In terms of sharing them, we do try and share them through our channels, but in terms of documenting them, we didn't force fit a template on anybody. I think the case study template is pretty well known. What was your problem statement? How did you address it? What's the conclusion and next steps? Right. So if we can add visuals, data visualization is huge in our space. So
Right.
including any data viz is bonus. And naturally, some of our volunteers will also want to look at GitHub and see some of the actual programming and coding that might have gone into working with the data. So all that's out there in varying degrees over these 80 plus projects. And at the end of every event, we always host a wrap-up presentation, which for me feels like a celebration because of all the work that's gone into producing the event and all the work that went in over the weekend or over the Saturday. And then to have the not-for-profit stakeholders sit and listen to all our great volunteers presenting their insights and the work they did. That's to me a success, like
Yes.
that wrap-up moment. And then we hear from them. We typically hear from them after that, just how grateful they are, how much of a gap we've filled, and what they're going to hopefully do with the results.
That's amazing. I think there's a lot of organizations that do such great work, but it's behind the scenes, right? And they don't often get to that event. So you've kind of indicated, you've given some great tips on how organizations can showcase that through case studies, through events, through recognition. I think we got to continue to celebrate our success, right?
We have to keep our own selves motivated too.
Yeah, absolutely. You have all this amazing work to look back on as well too. So when it comes to maybe some of the more on the more technical side, what are some of the online platforms that have worked best for you and your organization?
Okay, well, you're opening a can of worms this week because it's Twitter week, isn't it?
Yes.
So, we've used everything that we could get our hands on. Meetup was our original organization tool, and we pay for that, but it's not an onerous amount. The free platforms, of course, we went on those right away to get the word out. So now it's sort of, well, where do we go next? Is Twitter really going to change a lot? Should we rely more on TikTok or LinkedIn? Like, where should we go next?
Right.
And so social media, I think, is a necessary evil. It does help spread the word, and we all need to do that to gain volunteers, have influence, build brands, and seek support. I'm grateful for the platforms we've used, and they've been crucial, especially when we couldn't do our in-person events. It was like, oh, what a lifeline they all proved to be.
Yes.
But still, face-to-face communication is where it's at, in my opinion. We all crave that part of life. And Data for Good started out in part to create a constructive space for face-to-face in person for those who were already pre-pandemic working from home or remote or were one person with their skill set in a shop. And they didn't have colleagues to connect with because they were out of university. There was only one data scientist or machine learning expert on staff. And this was a way for them to network and connect with colleagues and peers.
Right. So you establish that kind of sense of community for them early on, which is incredible. And I think, now that it's fully remote, there are people starting roles that, they don't actually have a team in person. So it is exciting to build that community. And now, again, it's across the country, which is great. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things you've learned or best practices you can share when it comes to marketing and communications in the sector. Obviously, you started, you had a corporate background as well. So what are some tips? You've touched on a few already, but are there any other marketing communications tips you'd like to share?
Well, I love I don't know who said it, but a candle loses no flame by lighting another. It's so simple. It's so beautiful. And it's very true for us as volunteers. Our volunteers continue to burn brightly. We pass torches. We keep the flame alive and light more candles in the dark, if you want to be metaphorical. But DataKind shared their light with us. Like they were back in 2012.
That was the inspiration?
Yeah,
yep.
It was. And now we both burn brighter for it. You can see them wearing Data for Good shirts. And we consistently reference them as our inspiration.
Yes.
So the people who want to give back in this world and want to feel good about it, the experience of donating, volunteering, and whatever else they're doing to share their light, it ought to be rewarding for them. Keep it hopeful, keep it purposeful and impactful, and stay positive. So that does translate into like the brand voice, right? The brand positioning and the messaging.
Right.
So following, DataKind, Jake Porway's lead, Jake has always used humor. And I've tried to do that as well because what we deal with sometimes is either academically complex or socially heavy. And so to have that ability to inject some levity is part of what I wanted the brand to do and continue to do.
Absolutely.
Even when, Joy, the co-founder, is gone, I want the brand to maintain that.
That's so exciting. And that's a great inspiration for other organizations when they're using their data, when the actual charities and nonprofits are trying to share these stats and share these important learnings. How can they do that in a way that's going to, evoke emotion? And one of those emotions, of course, is humor. And people do remember that as well. And they're more drawn to it. So I love that you brought that into it. Since the pandemic, which obviously we know transformed a lot of industries, how have you seen some of the marketing efforts change from different organizations? And
yes.
How has it affected your work?
Well, demographics and segmentation and things like that, these aren't new to marketers. But I've heard that right now we have 6 distinct generations at work in the world right now.
Wow.
6 distinct generations that have, major differences of opinion and outlook about what needs to happen next. And I happen to feel that I'm smack dab in the middle of them all, because I'm not too old, but I'm not especially young either. So having conversations with these unique segments requires, it's like gymnastics right now. There's so many different needs to meet right now. And so I think it's the best bet is to think strategically about where you can invest your efforts most effectively. And that's a hard call right now. That's each organization at a governance level and a strategic level needs to ask themselves, where do we want to invest going forward?
Yep.
Maybe this worked for us in the past. Maybe this will work for us today, but we have to think about our future. So it's a tough period of time to be in leadership. It's doable, but it takes a bit of gymnastics. So,
and it is a great time, or has been a great time, to reassess for sure. And I think organizations are looking at what worked. I heard a stat recently. I was at an event for the AFP conference for fundraisers, and they were talking about how significantly more effective it is to do online fundraising events, for example, so like online auctions, as opposed to the in-person ones. And they had seen some very compelling stat, like 87% more results were driven by the online auction. So those may be things they choose to continue, right, post-pandemic, of course. And I think there's learnings that people have adopted that will stick for sure. I wanted to ask, you did touch on this when it comes to, budgeting and fundraising, but for your organization, it's a volunteer-driven organization. I'm assuming that, budget-wise for marketing, it's all word of mouth. Is that how it operates?
Well, coming from the marketing background, I learned early how valuable word of mouth is, and referrals and repeat customers and things like that. So when starting Data for Good, I thought, well, that's the most effective thing anyway. So let's start right there and keep focusing on that as the priority. And being a non-soliciting not-for-profit means that we seek out in-kind support and donations, and that has also proved valuable to us. Of course, we don't move as fast as a corporate environment does with their marketing budgets and their timelines, but overall, I appreciate the incremental organic growth that we've achieved. So yes, it's not the same. It's not the same. When you have a big budget and you have a particular campaign calendar, you've got marching orders. This is different.
And you have the power of people, and it sounds like it's more of a great grassroots community-driven effort, which again can be just as powerful as ad dollars on social media. So on this show, of course, one of my goals for this show is to help be a resource to different organizations, people in the social good space. I would love to know, what is one source of inspiration, whether it's content, a book, a thought leader, that you've turned to? Okay,
well, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the original DataKind. Tons of inspiration from DataKind. But lately I've enjoyed what I've been hearing through my kids. So I have 12-year-olds and a 13-year-old, and there's the super clever shenanigans of people like Mark Roberg and Mr. Beast. I'm like their Team C's and their Team Trees campaigns. These were fantastic.
Yes,
they were very energizing and very very bright candles burning on this earth. So like for the ocean cleanup project, they brought a lot of attention to that. I mean, wow, if you look at what the Ocean Cleanup Project is actually doing, like they're not talking the talk. They're walking the walk. They are massively, right now, literally cleaning up the Pacific Ocean garbage patch.
Incredible.
It's happening. They're doing it.
So that's definitely inspiring. And with the Trees Project, I found it inspiring too. They exceeded their goals, right? And you see this community of people coming together to all promote it as well. So that just shows you the power of social media and using tech for good.
Well, it impressed my 13-year-old son because I had heard about Team Trees on my own. And then a couple years later, he was like, Mom, you should know more about this, trying to tell me about it. I was like, actually, I think I do know about that. I might have even donated towards it. Well, major points. I won a lot of points with my 13-year-old that
Relevancy.
day. Yes.
There you go. Yeah. So wrapping it up here, I'd love to know, what is one piece of advice that you would give to leaders in the nonprofit or charitable sector?
Sure. Well, throwing back to that metaphor, protect your flame. Protect your flame. Because the world needs your light, and we can't light any more candles if our own flame goes out. So it's almost an overriding, take care of yourselves, people, right? Because the world needs us, needs all of us.
Yeah, one of my colleagues, Hamza, he wrote a book about burnout, and he always talks about the whole concept of burn bright, not out. That's his reminder to us, right? Is you can be stronger when you're taking care of, right? When you're taking care of yourself. So that's a great reminder. I wanted to ask, what's something that you're excited about coming up?
Coming up, okay. Well, it's almost Christmas. I'm a kid still. Christmas. That's exciting.
Yeah.
And what else is going on? I mean, in the new year, hoping to go somewhere sunny in the new year. Now that everybody's traveling again. This year I went to Dubai, which was amazing.
Amazing, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was still bumpy. It was back in March, but I'm hoping travel is just getting smoother and smoother. Fingers crossed. I don't know. Have you gone somewhere lately?
We went to New York, and it was exciting to see the city kind of coming back to life. I know that they got pretty badly impacted by the pandemic early on, so that's super exciting. Got to travel to stay inspired and make new connections. That's what I love about it.
Yeah. Awesome.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Joy. Everyone else can check out your website, Data for Good. And I'm sure you'll continue to grow your chapters and make more of an impact.
Hopefully, yes.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Growth for Good. The show is presented by Daniel Does and produced by Creator Club in Toronto. You can find notes, links, and more about my guests at danieldoes.co, where you can also learn about ways we can collaborate. Feel free to connect with me anytime on LinkedIn or Twitter. If there is someone from the sector that you'd like to learn from or you'd like to be interviewed on the show, feel free to reach out to team@danieldoes.co. If you're considering creating a podcast or video series for your organization, connect with Creator Club at creatorclubstudios.com.